Brought to you by APG Chesapeake. Chesapeake Bay Live presents the Speaker Series, sponsored by For All Seasons. Today's Speaker Series features Lesa Lee and Beth Langrell from For All Seasons. Today's topic is suicide, depression, and anxiety. Let's talk about it. Well, Lesa, Beth Ann, let's talk about it.
Good evening and welcome to Suicide, Depression, and Anxiety. Let's talk about it. My name is Beth Ann Langrell. I'm the CEO at For All Seasons, your Mid-Shores Behavioral Rape Crisis Center and mental health agency.
My name is Lesa Lee, and I'm the Chief Clinical Officer here at For All Seasons.
We are so glad to be with you tonight and really have a conversation that I think is a difficult one to have, but really important in this time, and especially now during COVID, and with all that our folks in the community are experiencing, to be able to talk about what's happening for people and how people are feeling.
Yeah, for me, I've noticed even some of my friends reaching out saying, Lesa, there's a lot going on for me, and I've got to figure out how to get some help. And so whether it's just talking with that friend, or if it's, setting them up or getting them, contacted with services, it's one of the things that I have found that this is really shaking people up a little bit.
It's a totally different way of living. It's, a halting that we haven't experienced before. I've said several times throughout this pandemic that we are a society that is really craving connection, and we are human beings that need connection and communication. And so being able to pop over to a friend's house or be able to gather for a birthday party, there's so many areas of our lives that have shifted, that really being able to sort of wrap your head around that, and especially for our young people or for our older people who are really feeling a different sense of isolation, it can really move our mental health status into a place of feeling things differently than we felt before.
Right. I think that you said something really important, isolation. That's one thing that I think for me has really impacted the mental health part that I'm hearing a lot about, is people spending more time by themselves and not as connected is enhancing almost sometimes the feelings of anxiety or depression, and it makes it really challenging for them, for all of us, whether we're experiencing some mental health issues or not, that it's making it really challenging to manage some of the stuff that's going up.
And sometimes it's really a place of not knowing how to be able to even begin the conversation about it. Not knowing exactly what you're feeling, but knowing that you're feeling something different, and really trying to be able to pay attention to some of the things that are happening. Is the day looking different than it normally did? I think when this first started, I remember folks saying it kind of feels like a little vacation. We were in the stay at home, and you didn't have to necessarily get dressed every morning, and you could be in your sweatpants a little bit more often, and that felt like, okay, it's kind of like a break from whatever is happening. But we are a society that really counts on beginnings and ends. We want to know when school starts and when it is going to end. We want to know when our vacation is going to begin and when it's going to end. And part of what's been happening is that the control piece of all of those bookends that are so important to us as humans has completely been taken away. And so you started to live for these executive order announcements by the governor to figure out what was going to be next. And I know even for our employees who would say, well, can't we just make a plan until December? There's something to be said about the fact that you really can't plan very far into the future because you don't know what it's going to hold, and the mental toll that takes on your brain as you're having to process something new over and over and over again.
Right. And our brains are really meant to make sense of things. That's what we want to do, is try to understand why things are happening. And so when we can't make sense of it or figure out, like you said, if there's an end to it, it makes it more exhausting on our system. And so it increases sometimes our ability to manage difficult situations. And so for people who are maybe experiencing some depression, that might be, noticing more irritability or sadness That might be trouble with concentrating or sleeping or a change in appetite. So folks with anxiety might be unable to control a worry, whereas before the pandemic, they were able to control that in a different way. So concentration, worry, sleep, those are some signals that if they're happening over and over and more frequently, and it's sort of out of character for you, that it's giving you a cue that maybe something in your system is a little bit off, and we've got to figure out what we're going to do about that.
Absolutely, and I think we're in a time right now where mental illness is something that there's always been a stigma attached with being able to reach out for help. If you have diabetes and you need to go and get insulin from your doctor, nobody thinks twice about it. If somebody has a heart issue and they go see their cardiologist, not a big deal at all. Someone has a brain issue, because when you really get down to the heart of it, your brain is your largest muscle in your body, and it's your largest organ that needs to be taken care of. And I always think of the scale that they use in the legal system, and when you're depressed, your scales are just a little bit tipped. And so going to get some help, and whether you're seeing a therapist or a psychiatrist, it really just balances your brain back out. But there is something that happens for folks where people are not as comfortable saying, I'm going to my therapist. Maybe they'll say I'm going to the doctor. And so it's really important in these times where you might be noticing some of those things that are different, to be able to feel comfortable or be able to reach out. And it might not be to the neighbor. Maybe you're not comfortable having the conversation with the neighbor, but maybe you are with a friend saying, I'm not doing okay and I really need to be connected to some services.
Right. And one of the things, just as a tip or a tool for if you're one of those people who is hearing that, if a person comes to you and says, I'm really struggling right now, and here's what's going on, and let's say you just don't know what to say, it's okay to say, I'm so glad that you told me. I'm not even sure what to say, but just that you shared that with me is so important. Or, hey, let's see if we can figure out somebody that can help you out with that. So being able to reach out and not have all the answers, but to be able to be with that person, that's just the first step.
And sometimes it's just that let's figure it out together.
Right.
And there are times where you might say, let's figure it out together, and then you might need to be, you might need to say to that person, we need to get somebody else involved. And so maybe you, as part of that figuring it out together, means that you get a relative or a friend that gets involved in the conversation. Or maybe you can go right to a resource like a mental health agency or a doctor and checking it out. But it's okay to get to a place in your journey where you might need to tag somebody else into the conversation or into the path that you're all walking together.
Right, because you can't always have the answers.
No.
And sometimes it's just being with that person is all that's needed, knowing that I'm here with you right here, right now, and we'll figure it out together. And sometimes it's being able to, like you said, reach out to another person to be able to help out with that. But giving yourself permission to not have to solve that problem, I think is so important for people. Because that's not sometimes what's in our wheelhouse. Maybe we just don't know what to do or what to say. So finding alternative solutions, I think, is really important for people.
Absolutely, because that's why we have experts.
Right,
It's not as though if you came to me and said my arm is broken, I'm not putting you in a cast.
Right.
That is not my expertise.
Right,
and so, being able to recognize that we can support people, but when it gets to a place where it's above and beyond our expertise, that's why there are mental health professionals, or there's pediatricians for your children, or your general practitioner doctors that might be able to step in a different component.
Right. And so one of the things that I think is important for folks when you say somebody can step in is to know, what does that mean? When do we actually send somebody to somebody? And so it's if a person is experiencing symptoms or feelings that are out of ordinary for them. So maybe we all get blue, we all get sad, we all have anxiety. But if it's something that is more consistent and is impacting your daily functioning, that's when we really want to reach out to other people to say, this is really something I'm struggling with, please help me.
Right, and I think also paying attention to some patterns. So if you're somebody who typically had a glass of wine when you would get home on a Friday night, but now you're starting to have a glass of wine at the end of every workday, and instead of being able to sit with a cup of tea, you're saying, I need a drink, or you're not going to the gym. Maybe you were somebody who was really involved in athletics and now all of a sudden you've stopped going to the gym. Those are some things that are important to pay attention to, because as our patterns shift and we move into a place of not being able to maintain healthy lifestyle and consistency, those are some also some areas where we might need to reach out for some help. No, we were talking a little bit about coping skills and strategies, and I think it's so important to think about how we are going through what we're going through, and what's happening for us, and how might patterns be shifting, and paying attention to that as we're thinking about depression and anxiety, and especially as we're having a conversation that's a tough one about suicide and suicidal ideation.
Right. You know, something that you said earlier I think is so important is if we notice that our coping skills, the way that we are used to handling situations, is starting to change, and change for maybe in a negative way, or people are starting to comment on that, I think it's important to pay attention to that. And it's just about being aware. Because one of the things that we want to be sure that people hear is that it's not about judgment. It's not about you're drinking too much, or you're not eating enough, or you're eating too much. It's about something shifted, and we really want to pay attention to that to get to know what's happening for you. And so really being able to pay attention not only for the people that we care about in our circle, but also for ourselves, is something just doesn't feel like me anymore. And I'll tell you, the idea of suicide comes up for people a lot. You know, just thinking about that is an option. This is like, things are so challenging for me right now that this feels like the only option for me is to end my life. And I'll say, one of the things that I ask people often when they come to my office is it that you want to die, or is it that you want the pain to go away? And I will tell you, oftentimes people say, I just want this pain to go away. I just don't want to feel this way anymore.
Yeah, and I think you even just bringing up that question. You know, so many times when we talk about suicide in our community, folks will say, I'm really supposed to ask someone the question, do you want to kill yourself? And it's a really fearful question for a lot of people. And my answer is always yes. It's okay to be having the conversation and say, help me understand how you're feeling, and help me understand what you're thinking, so that we can then be able to connect them to the best resources possible. Because I think when you talk about someone wanting to die versus someone wanting the pain to go away, we all know what it feels like to have a pain that we just want to be able to move through. And being able to identify that, or being able to identify that someone's saying, no, it's worse than that, is really important in this conversation.
So when you talk about having those hard conversations, that's exactly what it is. And it's remembering you don't have to have an answer.
Right, right.
It's about being there in that moment, talking, listening, processing with that person about that experience, but saying, this feels like a great opportunity for us to look at some resources, and I'm here with you. And I will be along the journey as long as you'll let me.
And sometimes it's not going to be as simple as, I'm with you, because somebody might say, I don't want you anywhere near me.
Right.
And so then it's the hard conversation of, how do you manage when someone says, I don't want your help? And you have to continue to show up. You know, that's one of the things that we say all the time to folks who are struggling with family members or friends. Continue to show up, and know that you might not have the conversation the first time. It might not be successful. It might be a horrible situation where you're not really sure what's going to happen next, but continue to show up and be able to say, I'm here. Whether you want to listen today or whether we want to have a talk tomorrow, I'm here.
It is a strategy that somebody uses in order to protect themselves.
Right.
And if people can keep in mind that that person is suffering and hurting, and their strategy is to say, go away, and that will increase the isolation. And so being able to show up and be with that person despite the hard times is so important. And if there is a struggle and they keep pushing away, it is okay to call a helpline to say, what do I do now?
Right, right.
What do I do? Yeah. Because they don't have to be the professionals to know the exact what do I do, but somebody can walk them through those steps.
Absolutely. I think that's so important, is that there are hotlines. You know, we have our own hotline at our agency and we are answering that phone 24 hours a day. There's a suicide hotline. It's okay to call and say, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. I'm stuck. You don't have to be, all composed on these phone calls. It's okay if you are upset, if you are crying and saying, I have no idea what to do, please help. That's what those hotlines are there for, because sometimes it's not going to be as picture perfect as we want it to be when you go and approach someone and say, I see that you're struggling, or I think that something's going on, or help me understand what's going on. Those are conversations that aren't always going to go well.
Right. And so let me say, if you are a person who is struggling with anxiety, depression, or thoughts about suicide, or if you are a person who has a loved one or somebody, a friend that you are in communication with that is having those problems, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask for that support. And know this is, I think, super important. That is a part of them that is suffering. Please hear that. That is not who they are. Depression is not who they are. Anxiety is not who they are. Suicide is not who they are. Those are parts of them that are experiencing something that is really out of character for them. And our job when we work in therapy is to figure out, how do we get them back to the person they're meant to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's also when we talk about mental illness, depression doesn't define the person. It happens to be a piece of the person. And so you're a person who happens to have a diagnosis of depression. You are not a depressed person. It doesn't define you. And there are so many ways that through therapy and through reaching out that we can help get back to the person who is the successful man or the successful woman who happens to have a diagnosis or who happens to be feeling symptoms of. I think that's, and being able to sort of frame it that way. It's not like you walk around and say, like, that is a cardiac patient who happens to be a man.
Right.
I think there's different ways that we can think about it. And we talk about reaching out for help all the time, but we know that in our line of work, that 2.5 times more, it's the women that are reaching out than the men. And I think there's such an important conversation to be had about making it okay in our society for men to say, I'm struggling. We know that when we look at our statistics of suicide, we know that men are more successful in attempting suicide because of the ways that they try to kill themselves. And it might be a gun, or it might be something else that is a little bit more lethal. Mm-hmm. Women have a tendency to use things like pills or something different that isn't as final in that moment and has the ability to come back. We aren't able to necessarily have the same conversations with men because there is a stigma for men reaching out. Right. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be able to talk about, that it's okay for men to be vulnerable. It's okay for our providers to say, I'm struggling. It's okay to say, I am the provider in the home. How do I provide when I've lost my job and now I need help? Those are really important conversations to be having.
Right. And just having the conversation right now, I imagine, makes people uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Hard conversations about suicide, depression, men reaching out for mental health, I think are really uncomfortable. And my hope is, I think our hope is, that when people hear this, that they know that it is absolutely okay. Yeah. And that we recognize when we talk about vulnerability, we also know that there's shame, right? So women, maybe we hold shame in the way that says, I have to be Wonder Woman. I have to be the mother, the teacher, the cook, the cleaner, the whatever role that we put ourselves under. And so for women, we hold a different way in shame, like, I'm not enough, I didn't do enough. Men are going to hold shame much differently than women. They're going to be thinking about providing, and I can't be vulnerable. I have to be the man on the white horse. And so knowing that those things are something that affect men and women differently, that can be addressed if we have conversations, because shame does not survive if you talk about it. Shame survives with secrets, silence, and judgment.
Absolutely. And I think that judgment piece is so important. So to be able to say, whatever you're feeling, it's okay.
Right.
And knowing that it's okay not to be okay. It's okay for us in this time to say, I'm not okay.
So we were just talking a little bit about shame and how it shows up. And one of the things that's important for people to remember is shame cannot survive with secrets, silence, and judgment, or shame survives with secret, silence, and judgment. And it doesn't survive, so if you throw it in a petri, just as Brene would talk about, and you throw in empathy, that's one of the things that helps, as well as communicating to people. So we know that some people are really good at communicating and some people have to build that skill. We also know that folks with depression or having these thoughts, they might think, I hear this all the time in my practice, I'm crazy, there's something wrong with me. So one of the things that if we can say anything, and you could take just a little niblet out of this, if you can hear yourself and offer yourself just a little bit of compassion, knowing that this isn't who you are, this is a part of you that is suffering, and that you can take that little bit of compassion towards yourself, no different than you would speak to a friend or your child or a loved one. Would you say those things to that person, right?
We tend to be so much harder on ourselves and forget that we have to speak to ourselves as kindly as we do to the other people in our lives that we care about. And the other thing that I think is so important about what you said is that when we're thinking about our language, about how we're talking to ourselves, you talk about folks that are coming into your office for therapy saying, I'm crazy, or there's something wrong with me. I think there's also another component of all of this that comes in the language that we are using as people. And so, be mindful of how we're talking. And so if you're equating something negative to, well, that person's crazy, if you say that to someone who has a mental illness, the chances that they're going to come to you for support or for advice, if you're really mindful of if we as a society and as friends and neighbors and family members, if we are conscious of the language that we are using, our words can either open the door for a conversation or they can shut somebody down completely, because inherently in that conversation of, well, look at that person, they're crazy, that's putting judgment on something that we don't know. And so, that old adage of you've never walked in someone else's shoes, and being able to know that when you see a parent who's having a difficult time with a child in a grocery store parking lot, being able to take that step back and saying that something's happening for that person, that doesn't mean that it's a bad parent, but being able to sort of enter every conversation with grace. And it's not necessarily what's wrong with you, but it might be about what's happened to you. And we talk about that a lot with our children and adverse childhood experiences. And our agency does a lot of work helping people be able to see one another differently. And if we can go into conversations with a lens of what's happened versus what's wrong with you, then sometimes we'll be able to enter into that conversation where someone who might be feeling suicidal is going to be more willing to talk with us.
Right. And when you talk about what happened to you and offering that to that person, again, it's so important for that person who might be experiencing the thoughts of suicide or the depression or the anxiety to speak to themselves that same way. Right? So to take that in and be able to say, something's going on, and it's okay for me to reach out for help, or it's okay for me to connect with somebody. It's okay for me to do what I need to take care of myself. I don't have to keep running and, not paying attention to what's happening to me.
And that's so important. I so appreciate that you say that, because I think in times where we are struggling, there could be that sort of mode of, if I stay really busy, and if I don't have to sit in my stuff and I don't have to acknowledge it, I can just keep going and going and going and going. And at some point, your poor brain gets so fatigued from having to continue to go and go and go. And so also pay attention to that. So if you're someone who typically would have stayed home and had a cup of tea and watched a television show in the evening, and now you are continually going and going and going and need to be around people all the time, there might be a check-in that needs to happen about, are you running from something, or are you trying to ignore what's really happening, and really trying to pay attention to that as patterns too.
Right. I would say one of the most challenging things can be, for any of us, no matter what we're experiencing, but to slow down and do that check-in. And so I think that that's such valuable information for people to have, which is slow down, check in, And here's what I would say, and I would be a hypocrite, and I would be, one, I'm a horrible liar. And so for me, I am, you know that. If I said, what I'm saying to you is there is no doubt in my mind that somewhere along the way, you will get help and be able to be helped. And so if there's something going on with you, you don't have to do this alone. Like for me, like there's always hope. And I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think people could have that.
Absolutely.
And so knowing that you have to find the right person, because that's a challenge. Because when we're depressed or when we're struggling with something, sometimes we find the evidence of the not so good.
Right, why it's not going to work.
Right.
And no one's going to be able to help.
Right.
And I always say that, finding a good therapist is like finding a good pair of shoes. It might take trying on one or two, and then you might click right away. But that ability to stay open and have sort of that positive feeling sometimes suffers when someone is feeling depressed or continuing to sit in their own anxiety.
Right. And so it's really getting back to that person that they're meant to be. And I know without a doubt, that that person is in there. It is just guarded with what I call a defensive line.
Right.
So parts of them that are using strategies in order to maybe avoid that feeling or avoid that situation or just handle the uncertainty of what's happening.
Right, absolutely. And one of the things that we know, if you're someone who has, watching someone in your life who is struggling, the ability to, our agency has a campaign called Ask, Listen, Share, and it's a way for us to provide some things that we hope you're going to be able to hear tonight. Not only hear the conversation and know that it's okay to have it, but then have a strategy of ask the question. And stick around for the answer so you listen to what the person has to say. And once you've heard that person and engaged in that conversation, be able to share resources and connect. There are so many times in our own lives, myself included, where I'll say to somebody, "How you doing?" And I'm so busy moving on to the next thing. Have I really stopped to hear what's happening with that person? And so Ask, Listen, Share is a really beautiful way to remind ourselves to ask that question and stay and listen for the answer. And it's amazing how when we give somebody 5 minutes of time, if they're given the platform to be able to say, "I'm not doing okay," then there's so much more that we can hear from someone, and then be able to share resources for the agency, whether it's connecting someone to mental health therapy, it might be someone who's struggling with depression and anxiety, because there's also substance abuse involved, and so connecting them to AA. There's so many resources in our community, and the beauty of the Ask, Listen, Share is that you'll find information out because you've simply asked the question.
Right. And I think it's also important to make sure that it's not just ask, listen, and share with adults,
Right.
but we're doing that with kids, because kids are not immune to having thoughts about harming themselves and suicide or depression or anxiety. So use this as a whole global scope. It's from littles to olders, and that we're listening and asking and sharing with everybody. And I love, please put your phones down.
Right.
Listen to what's being said, and know you don't have to have all the answers,
Right.
that there's a team out here that supports you.
Absolutely. And I think that conversation with our young people, it's out there. And, our you talk about phones, and we've talked about screen time so many times with our own children. Our children are seeing information about depression and anxiety and suicide. And there's television shows and Netflix shows that talk about it. So being able to open up that conversation, and maybe you're sitting here as a parent saying, "I have no idea how to do this." We, as an agency, can help have that conversation with you. You can also find a friend. I know there are some friends who will say, you're a good role model for my child. Can you have this conversation with them? And so if you're not feeling comfortable having that conversation, bring somebody into the mix who might be able to help you move that conversation forward with your child, because I think you're so right that younger and younger, our children are being exposed to some of the things that we might not have had any clue about until middle school or high school.
Right. So really having the hard conversations and being brave and finding that person, if you aren't able to have that conversation with your child, that's not a problem. But you want to be the one or finding a trusted person to have that conversation so that they're not getting that off of social media, that you can explain that. So whether it's a grown-up or a child, that you're the one having the conversation to be able to have an honest and realistic conversation rather than them getting misinformation from the internet, if that makes sense.
And I think that's really important, and I explain to parents and to young people all the time, and it even goes for us as adults. Choose your five.
Right.
Who are the five people that your children can go to and have that conversation with them? If they aren't feeling comfortable talking to you as a parent, who are those five trusted people in their lives that they can go to if they're struggling? And as adults, we need to think of that too. You know, who are the five people in our circle that when the toughest of tough days have happened, you feel comfortable enough to say, I need help? Because again, it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to reach out for help. And that's why we're having this conversation tonight.
Right.
We're so glad that you joined us this evening to talk about a tough topic. And we know that in this time of COVID, everyone is feeling something different than they have felt before. And so you might be sitting here feeling like you can identify with some of what we've talked about this evening, or maybe you have a loved one who is struggling. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We are your Midshore Behavioral Health and Rape Crisis Center at For All Seasons. You can reach us at 410-822-1018. You can find us on the web at forallseasonsinc.org. You can find us on Facebook at For All Seasons, RCC. We are here. We have offices all across our Midshore. And the number one thing that we want you to know is that no matter what is happening in your life right now, you are not alone, and we are here.